هر وەکو دەبینین مەترسیە کە لەسەر ناوچە و لەسەر هەرێمی کوردستانیش هەیە ئەوەیە کە ئەمریکا وا خەریکە بە فراوانی لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست دەکشێتەوە ڕۆلیشی لە ناوچەکەدا جیاوازتر دەبیتن ئەمەش حتما کاریگەری خۆی دەبێت لەسەر هەرێمی کوردستان بۆیە بە پێویستمان زانی بۆ زیاتر ڕوونکردنەوەی سیاسەتی خارجی ئەمریکا لەسەر ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست بە تایبەت لەسەر هەرێمی کوردستان داوا لە بەڕێز دکتۆر دەیڤید ڕۆمانۆ بکەین کە توێژینەوەیەک لە بارەدا پێشکەش بکەتن. پێشەوەی کە دەرفەت بدەین قسەمان بۆ بکەت پێناسەیەکی کورتی دکتۆر دەیڤید ڕۆمانۆ بکەین. جەنابیان پرۆفسۆر دکتۆر دەیڤید ڕۆمانۆ مامۆستای زانکۆیە لە زانکۆی میزوری لە وڵاتە یەکگرتووەکانی ئەمریکا، دکتۆرای هەیە لە زانستە سیاسیەکان، پرۆفسۆرە لە سیاسەتی ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست، چەندین بڵاوکراوەی لەسەر کورد و ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست نووسیوە، لەوانە دوو کتێب، یەکێکیان بزودنەوەی ناسیۆنالیستی کورد و ململانێ بە دیموکراسیکردن و پرسی کورد لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست تورکیا، ئێران، عێراق و سووریا. لە ساڵی 2002ەوە ستونووسی تەلەڤیزیۆنی ڕۆوداوە، توێژینەوەکانی لە ژورنالەکانی بەناوبانگی وەک ژورنالی ئۆکسفۆرد لەسەر لێکۆڵینەوەکانی پەنابەران و ژورنالی سیاسەتی ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست و ئێتنۆسیاسی و ژورنالی خوێندنی کوردی بڵاوبوونەتەوە. چەندین خەلاتی وەرگرتووە، لەوانە خەلاتی پارێزگای میزوری بۆ فێرکردن لە ساڵی 2015، 2020 خەلاتی زانکۆی میزوری بۆ خزمەتگوزاری و پەرەپێدان بە خوێندن لە دەرەوەی وڵات وەرگرتووە. ئێستاش بەڕێزیان لە ماوەی 30 خولێکدا لەسەر سیاسەتی دەرەوەی وڵاتە یەکگرتووەکانی ئەمریکا لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست و بە تایبەت هەرێمی کوردستان بۆمان قسە دەکات.
زۆر سپاس. ئەمەوێت ڕۆژێک بە زمانی کوردی بۆ وایە بگەڕمەوە، بەڵام هەشتا فەر دەبم، یعنی پێویستیم خوێندنی زیاترە لەبەرەوە ئەمڕۆ بە ئینگلیزی قسە دەکەم، یعنی ئەمجار شانستان هەیە. I want to thank the Institute for Research and Development of Kurdistan for inviting me to this exciting conference and also for hosting me so wonderfully. And today I want to talk about the foreign policies towards the Middle East of the United States. And I want to do so in general terms. I think there are some policies that are so general and overarching that they endure no matter who the president is, because in a country like the United States, it's not just the president that determines foreign policy. Sometimes they try, but the system always brings them back to those basic overarching goals. And in general, U.S. policy towards the Middle East has 3 goals. Fabrice and I see them similarly. I just describe them differently, the 3 goals. And I think they're very much often related. I think the PowerPoint is a little dark. I'm sorry about that. That would be my fault. If you can't see it, it doesn't matter. I will just explain things anyhow. The first goal is the continuation of stable petroleum flows to the West, oil and gas. The second one is to maintain stability internationally and in the Middle East. And the third goal is to contain enemies of the United States and rivals. So I want to talk about each of these a little bit more. Let's talk about the first one. So here we're looking at the continuation of stable petroleum flows to the West. Now this is very important for several reasons. The health of the world economy still depends on fossil fuels. As much as climate change may be a crisis and something we need to deal with, we're not there yet. We haven't transitioned to an alternative. And without stable petroleum flows, meaning oil and gas that's purchasable below a certain price, the world economy suffers severe problems. And that's not in the US interest, obviously. It causes inflation, especially. High oil and gas prices are the most indexed factor for inflation. For US elections, the economy matters. When there's inflation and world economic problems, there's American economic problems, and we get back to that old domestic electoral calculus in the United States, which is, it's the economy, stupid. And in the coming midterms in a few weeks in America, things are looking perhaps troublesome for the Democrats because of inflation and economic problems. So every US administration pays attention to these factors. And we have also the general issue of stability of the US-led world order. This depends on economic stability as well. This is one of the ways in which the three goals are interrelated. And finally, we have the economic health of key US allies. Basically, the European Union and Japan import virtually all their oil and gas. They're much more sensitive than, say, the United States or Canada or even Australia to disruptions in supply of oil and gas. They're not producers themselves, but they're key US allies. So these are reasons for this first overarching goal in US policy towards the Middle East. Let's move on. Second, we have the US desire to maintain stability internationally and in the Middle East. And, you know, the Iraq War of 2003 may have been an exception. Some people may describe it as a very destabilizing venture. I think in the eyes of many American policymakers in 2003, Saddam Hussein was the source of instability that had to be dealt with. So it kind of depends on perspective. No matter how things turned out, that may have been the reasoning then, at least part of it. And here, you know, the logic is simple. The world order is an American-led world order. So therefore, the United States wants that order stable. It's not rocket science. Now, the US also doesn't like border changes. Those are like the opposite of stability. And of course, this becomes a problem sometimes given Kurdish aspirations. Especially in a geopolitically important region like Kurdistan, the US is very disinclined to support border changes for this reason. Let's move on to did we do all three? Where's my number 3? Oh, wait. That much said, I think this may be a mistake. I put here a graph of Kurdish uprisings in the 20th century. And for a power that likes stability, it looks to me like there's a problem that they might want to address. And here in Iraq, that problem has been partially addressed through extensive levels of autonomy, but we still have a constitution that's not being faithfully observed. Maybe 55 articles by the count of the KRG that are not being observed. And so the federalism isn't being implemented properly, or there isn't enough of an attempt to implement federalism in Iraq, so it causes instability. The very fact of the Kurds having not been given a state of their own after the Treaty of Lausanne and of having been made victims of very centralizing Arab nationalist, Persian nationalist, Turkish nationalist regimes was a source of instability. And so for an American power that values international stability and stability in a geopolitically important region like the Middle East, they might want to pay attention to addressing the causes rather than just the symptoms of instability. And one of those causes would be a failure to accommodate the Kurds in a way that's appropriate, that's dignified. So overarching goal number 3. The United States, of course, wants to contain its enemies and rivals. So we're looking here at Islamist extremists, such as Daesh or Al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and others. But that's Iran, obviously, as my colleague did an excellent job in overviewing the threat of Iran for us, and as well Russia and China. Now, on this last point, many in the United States in the last couple of years have talked about a pivot to Asia and a focus on the more important threat of China and to a lesser degree Russia. I live in the middle of the United States in Missouri, and I hear the discourse all the time. We have to stop, losing our time in the Middle East, and we have to pay attention to the threat from China. And my response to that is, if you want to contain China, perhaps you need to keep paying attention to the Middle East, because we have things like the Road Initiative, the Belt Road Initiative, and China and Russia are very active in the Middle East and pursuing their ambitions here. So if the United States is interested in countering these powers, it cannot afford to turn away from the Middle East or ignore it. And I'm not sure they always realize that to the full extent that is necessary. And now I'd like to just, I'm not going to explain these. You guys know your own overarching goals better than anyone. But the way I see it, I think the Kurdistan region in Bashur, as well as in Rojava, could be described as having 3 general goals as well, which would be the protection of current levels of autonomy at a minimum, empowerment of the political authorities in these 2 Kurdistans against local rivals. It's a reality. And support for maximum levels of self-determination, whatever those may be. Now, basically, the Kurds try to use the United States to help them with their goals, and the United States tries to use the Kurds to help it with its goals. And occasionally that works for both parties. Occasionally it doesn't work so well. Occasionally they diverge. So I want to talk a little bit about US support for the Kurds and its limits, so to speak. Now, American support for the Kurds in Iraq and Syria unsurprisingly reflects the American agenda rather than the Kurdish ones. This has always been the case. You all know the history very well. In the 1970s, 1975, and then with the Gulf War, Operation Provide Comfort, we finally saw an instance where American and Kurdish interests coincided a bit better. It's thanks to Operation Provide Comfort that we have autonomy here in the Kurdistan region, and that was able to transition into recognized autonomy in the Constitution of 2005. And then we have issues post-2003 where, the American agenda didn't understand the importance of retaining the Peshmerga and security autonomy, or didn't put enough value on economic autonomy with oil and gas or other factors. And so the 2 agendas of the Kurds and the United States would see a bit more daylight between them at times. Post-2003, the Kurds have received very little political support from America for their agenda of maximizing self-determination. The American goals of maintaining stability in the region, however, continue to wed American policymakers to their one Iraq policy. They see the one Iraq policy as stability. They try to always have a man in Baghdad to work with. The US remains very averse against any redrawing of borders in the region. And this fits with the general American disinclination towards supporting separatist movements in general. And for the Kurds in Iraq, this has meant that on issues like disputed territories, Article 140, they haven't been receiving support that they expected. They made compromises to have those articles inserted in the Constitution, but it wasn't seen as a priority by Americans. They didn't get support for maintaining the number of seats in Parliament, on the oil and gas law, on other articles of the Constitution. The Americans simply weren't interested enough. Now, when it comes to US goals of containing rivals and opposing radical Islamist groups in the region, however, this necessitated military assistance and cooperation and protection of Kurdish parties in both Iraq and Syria, which did help the Kurds' agendas regarding empowerment vis-a-vis local competitors and protecting existing levels of autonomy in both Bashur and Rojava. Yet when given a choice between Baghdad versus Erbil in the referendum and its aftermath in 2017, the United States effectively supported Baghdad. I think US policy was on autopilot, as it often is when someone's not paying attention, perhaps as much as they should. And events unfolded so quickly in October of 2017, with the Kurdish lines in Kirkuk dissolving so quickly that the US state, the whole United States, hardly had time to react. I think this is an important point I'll get back to before I finish. There's a contrast to this and 2019 when we saw the US under President Trump try to throw the Kurds of Rojava under the bus, but the rest of the American state prevented him from doing so completely. There was time for the rest of the country to turn against one president's policy choice. That time did not happen in October 2017. I think it could have. I think it could have gone differently, but there needed to be time. The lines dissolved so quickly in Kirkuk that there was none. The US will continue to need Kurds to influence policy in Baghdad, so it doesn't want them to secede, but it also doesn't want them overrun. It wants to protect Kurdish autonomy, and it needs the Kurds in Iraq as a kind of balance together with the Arab Sunnis, preventing Iraq from becoming overwhelmingly Shiite and even more in the orbit of Iran. So the Kurds are, for the US, a balancing force in Iraq. And this is a main reason why the US does not want Kurdish secession from Iraq. That and the general fear of instability, Turkey's desires, which may play a bit less of a role today than they used to. Nonetheless, I think the Kurdish strategy of forcing the US via a crisis to back Kurdish independence could possibly work in some circumstances. It could have worked in 2017, but it can't work as long as they're divided and can be peeled away the way they were by actors like Qasem Soleimani and others, like happened in October 2017. How much time do I have left?
Conclude it.
Okay, so I can conclude it. Give me 5-10 max?
Sure.
Good, okay, good. So a lot of what I've said is true in Syria as well. There's next to no political support from the US for the Kurds in Syria. In Syria, the US needs the Syrian Kurds to have a seat at the table when it comes to post-Syrian civil war settlements or agreements. It needs them there to contain Iran. It may even need them in a very Machiavellian way for leverage on Turkey. If the United States hasn't thought about this yet, maybe they should. But the United States doesn't see a need to support Syrian Kurdish political aspirations for more than de facto autonomy in the areas where they are. Now, the Syrian Kurds can live with that. The longer they have de facto autonomy, the more it becomes a fact on the ground that people get used to, which is essentially the story of Bashur from 1991 to 2003. Now, Trump's surprise announcement of a withdrawal of US forces in October 2019 was crazy in this respect. It contradicted his own art of the deal principles, where you don't do something for nothing. He basically got off the phone with Erdogan and was like, okay, unless there was something promised to him that we don't know about. And it compromised, of course, the fight against ISIS and Tahrir al-Sham and others. And the cost of keeping 2,000 US special forces in Syria wasn't very high. Now, what was interesting is we saw the American state, the larger American state, the sum of whose behavior, I would argue, tends to be rational, if not the behavior of an individual president, react very badly against his choice. It wasn't just because of an American moral attachment to the Kurds from the fight against ISIS and so forth, but because of American interests. It seems nonetheless clear that Iraqi and Syrian Kurdish forces were long used by the US and others as only a short to medium term means of achieving US policy goals or other countries' policy goals. The US and other states always preferred long-term relations and alliances with fellow states over sub-state actors, such as the Kurds. Cooperation and alliances with the Kurds have been more shallow and temporary. The Kurds were regarded as friends and allies when they were needed, but dispensable if necessary. This is what led US Special Representative for Syria, James Jeffrey, at the Atlantic Council in Washington on December 17, 2019, to say that, quote, "We do not have permanent relationships with sub-state entities. That is not the policy of this administration, and it has not been the policy of other administrations." Now, this was a strong statement for him to make, especially at that time, but there's a chance that this approach is changing vis-a-vis the Kurds. Sorry, these slides are too dark anyhow. I think it's changing, but, and that's back to the events of October 2019. Trump was very erratic at that time, and they ended up even making fun of him in America. I don't know if the video will come up. Do we have internet to run the embedded video? Yeah? No, it didn't go. Okay, we'll see if it comes up. But basically, Trump said one thing in 2018, said something about the Kurds, that they're great allies, they died with us and for us fighting ISIS. And then in 2019, suddenly he's saying they're not angels, they have a lot of sand to play with, and we can't be over there forever. And the rest of the American state, members of his own party, not just Democrats, but other Republicans, members of civil society, his own civil servants like Jim Mathis and Brett McGurk both resigned. And then staunch allies of him in the Republican Party, church leaders, others, they all reacted against him betraying the Kurds in Syria, saying this is bad, this is wrong. And this was like the first time he had everyone disagreeing with him. And it led him to walk back the policy a little bit. Not before like 100 to 200,000 people were ethnically cleansed from various areas along the border, but in time to leave some troops in Syria and maintain some de facto Kurdish autonomy there. Now that was interesting. That was extremely interesting to me because it shows that it shows a lesson for Kurdish policy. And lobbying in the United States. And this will be what I conclude on. It's a lesson about what Kurdish parties need to do to strengthen relations with the United States. They need to remember that the United States is not just the president and the White House. In fact, it's not just Washington, D.C. The United States is more than that. So the Kurds need to develop relations with as many different levels of American society as possible, rather than just the White House, congressmen, and senators. This means lobbying in the US cannot be limited to just Washington, D.C. The Kurdistan Regional Government should develop relations with local state-level political leaders in all 50 states. It should develop relations with business people in America, media, academia, civil society groups, churches, synagogues, mosques in America, everyone that they can. And I'll give an example of a very successful lobby group in the United States, which actually spends a lot less money than the Arab states on lobbying in the US, and that is Israel. I don't know if you know, but Israel does not spend nearly as much money on political lobbying in the United States as the Arab states do, yet it is much more effective. Now, there's lessons to be learned here. If the Kurdistan Regional Government isn't doing it already, it should be talking to people in the American Jewish community about how they organize their lobbying. It should be talking to experts on the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. To give you just an example, I'm not such an expert, but I'll give you an example. Israel sponsors tours for business, religious leaders, state-level politicians, academics. Every year, they bring groups of Americans to Israel, and they do a one-week tour that shows them all the issues going on in Israel. And it's quite a tour. Like, they even take them on a helicopter to show them how small the territory is and what the security challenges are. They take them to meet Palestinians as well, and members of all the different communities. Bashur could do the same thing. And I don't just mean the textile museum here or the museum in Halabja. Those are great things, don't get me wrong. But I mean experiences that will be experiences of a lifetime for a church leader or a business leader or a congressman or a Missouri state congressman. Take them to Hendrin in the mountains with some Peshmerga veterans of the 1960s and 70s. Bring some Bolno rifles, the old antique rifles. Let them shoot something at 500 meters. Explain to them what happened in 1966 and in other battles. Then bring them to Biada or Salgat and have them have lunch with the villagers and explain how Ansar al-Islam and other groups took over and how a joint US Kurdish force pushed the Islamist radicals out, how it was a success story. They love success stories. And how the Kurdistan Regional Government is working to keep the Islamists out. Do things like that. And then take them to like Mosul or Kirkuk and show them the state of those cities compared to places in Bashur. By the time they go home, you will have made an ally for life for free, not some lobby organization you have to pay every year. And I guess I'm out of time. Thank you for letting me go.
زۆر سپاسی دکتۆر